In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where civilizations rise and fall like waves upon cosmic shores, there exists a fundamental truth that every species learns too late. Never underestimate the quiet ones. For 300 years, the Galactic Council had dismissed humanity as just another primitive species, barely worth acknowledgement. They saw our small fleets, our modest colonies, our peaceful trade agreements, and labeled us as weak. They watched us bow our heads in diplomatic meetings, accept unfavorable treaties, and retreat from conflicts, and they thought they understood us. They were catastrophically wrong. What they mistook for weakness was restraint. What they saw as submission was strategy. And what they failed to recognize was that behind humanity's patient smile lay the accumulated wisdom of a species that had clawed its way from caves to stars, that had survived ice ages and plagues, wars and famines, and emerged stronger each time. The Council's greatest mistake wasn't underestimating human technology or military might. It was underestimating the human heart, that peculiar mixture of compassion and fury, honor and ruthlessness that makes humans capable of both incredible mercy and terrifying vengeance. They failed to understand that a species capable of such profound love is equally capable of devastating wrath. When the Council's arrogance finally crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, when their casual cruelty shattered something sacred to humanity, they discovered a truth that would reshape the galaxy forever. There is nothing more dangerous than a human who has nothing left to lose, and nothing more unstoppable than humanity united in righteous anger. This is the story of how blood and honor crossed paths in the darkness between stars, and how that collision changed the course of galactic civilization forever. This is the story of humanity's awakening, not as the galaxy's servants, but as its reckoning. The first thing Ambassador Sarah-chan noticed when she entered the council chambers was the smell. It wasn't the sterile, recycled air she expected from the massive space station that served as the Galactic Council's headquarters. Instead, there was something organic and unpleasant like rotting vegetation mixed with ozone. She tried not to wrinkle her nose as she walked across the polished floor toward the central speaking platform. 300 species from across the galaxy had representatives in these chambers, though only the 12 most powerful held permanent seats on the ruling council. Humanity was not among them. Despite 3 centuries of loyal service, despite contributing more resources than half the permanent members combined, humans remained relegated to the outer circle of associate members, a polite term for useful servants. Sarah's heels clicked against the crystalline floor as she approached her designated spot. The sound echoed strangely in the vast chamber, where the ceiling stretched so high it disappeared into artificial clouds. Around her, beings of every imaginable shape and size filled the tiered seating. Some breathed methane, others thrived in crushing gravity or toxic radiation. The council chambers were a marvel of engineering that could accommodate them all simultaneously, though the compromises made the environment barely tolerable for any single species. She could feel eyes upon her, or eye analogs in many cases. The whispers had already started. The humans are making another petition. How quaint. What do they want this time? Sarah-chan had been Earth's chief diplomat for 15 years. She had negotiated mining rights on dead worlds, mediated disputes between species that viewed each other as mythological demons, and somehow managed to keep humanity relevant in a galaxy that seemed determined to forget they existed. She was known for her patience, her careful words, her ability to find compromise where others saw only conflict. Today will be different. The Zephyrian Council speaker, a being that looked like a cross between a mantis and a crystalline sculpture, gestured for silence with one of its forearms. The chamber fell quiet except for the hum of life support systems working overtime to keep hundreds of different species alive in the same space. The Council recognizes Ambassador Sarah-chan of the Human Colonial Alliance, the speaker announced, its voice translated through quantum resonance into frequencies each species could understand. You may present your petition. Sarah stepped forward, her tablet containing carefully prepared notes tucked under her arm. She wouldn't be needing it. The words she needed to say weren't written down anywhere. They were carved into her heart by images she couldn't unsee, by reports that had arrived from the Kepler colony just 48 hours ago. "Honored Council," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic enhancement systems. "I stand before you today, not with a petition, but with a question. A simple question that I believe goes to the very heart of what the Galactic Council claims to represent." Murmurs rippled through the assembled delegates. This wasn't how human presentations usually began. Typically, Earth's representatives were deferential to the point of servility. "The question is this," Sarah continued, taking another step forward. "What is the value of a promise?" Council Speaker Vextai's crystalline head tilted slightly. A gesture Sarah had learned indicated either confusion or mild irritation. "Ambassador Chun, if you have a specific grievance or request, please state it clearly. The Council's time is valuable." "Oh, I will be specific," Sarah replied, her voice remaining level despite the fury building inside her chest. "But first, let me provide context. 3 weeks ago, the human colony on Kepler 442b requested emergency assistance. A solar flare had damaged their atmospheric processors. Without immediate repair, 12,000 colonists, men, women, and children, would face slow suffocation as their air became toxic. She paused, letting that image sink in. 12,000 people, including 3,000 children under the age of 10. The nearest Council relief ship was the Sorthack Medical Frigate, stationed only 6 hours away. The Kepler colony sent a formal request through proper channels. They offered to pay triple the standard emergency rate. They begged. Sarah's voice remained steady, but something in her tone was making some of the council members shift uncomfortably in their seats. The Sorthack commander, acting under Council Emergency Protocol 447, denied the request. The reason given was that the colony had failed to file the proper environmental impact assessment for their atmospheric processors 18 months ago. A paperwork violation. The commander stated that council ships could not assist colonies operating outside regulatory compliance. The chamber was growing quieter. Even species that typically paid no attention to human affairs were beginning to focus on Sarah's words. "Now," Sarah said, her voice beginning to crack slightly, "I want to tell you what happened next. The colonists, faced with certain death, made a decision that will haunt every human in the galaxy for the rest of our lives. They began selecting who would live and who would die. Families drew lots. Parents volunteered to give their heir to their children. Husbands and wives argued over who deserved to survive." She reached into her jacket and withdrew a data crystal, holding it up where the entire chamber could see it. "This contains the final transmissions from Kepler Colony. The last voice belongs to Dr. Marcus Webb, the colony's chief administrator. He was 43 years old. He had 2 daughters, ages 8 and 12. In his final message, he asked me to tell the council that the colonists forgave us for failing them. They forgave us." Sarah's voice broke on the last word, but she forced herself to continue. "Dr. Webb spent his last breath asking me to ensure that this never happens to anyone else, to any species, to any world. He died believing that the council cared about justice, about protecting innocent life, about the promises we make to each other as civilized beings sharing this galaxy." The chamber was now dead silent. Even a constant background hum of life support seemed muted. "So, I return to my question," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger now, fed by a cold anger that seemed to radiate from her like heat from a forge. "What is the value of a promise? Because the Galactic Council promised to protect colonies that contribute to the common good. The Council promised that emergency protocols would prioritize life over bureaucracy. The Council promised that no member species would be abandoned to face existential threats alone." She took another step forward, now standing at the very edge of the speaking platform. 12,000 humans are dead. They died gasping for air while a ship capable of saving them sat 6 hours away, its commander too concerned with paperwork to save lives. Their children died, clutching toys, and calling for parents who couldn't breathe enough to answer them. The data crystal caught the chamber's artificial light as Sarah held a higher. But the truly damning evidence isn't in this crystal. It's in the Council's own records. Because this isn't the first time. In the past 5 years, Council ships have refused emergency assistance to human colonies 17 times. 17 times. Each refusal was justified by some technicality, some regulatory violation, some bureaucratic excuse. Angry voices began to rise from various sections of the chamber. Some demanded she be allowed to continue. Others called for her removal. The council speaker was gesturing frantically for order. Yet in that same period, Sarah continued, her voice now carrying over the growing din. Council ships have provided emergency assistance to non-human colonies 43 times despite similar regulatory violations. The Andorian mining operation on Vega 7 received atmospheric assistance despite operating without proper licenses. The Centauran research station on Wolf 359 got evacuation support despite violating quarantine protocols. The Rigelian trade hub on Alpha Centauri was resupplied during a crisis despite being in violation of 17 different safety codes. The chamber erupted into chaos. Delegates were shouting in dozens of languages, accusations flying back and forth. The council speaker was repeatedly calling for order, its crystalline form flickering with agitation. Sarah waited for the noise to die down slightly before delivering her final blow. So I asked the council once more, what is the value of a promise? Because if promises only apply to some species and not others, if human lives matter less than proper documentation, if our children can be left to suffocate while others receive aid despite identical violations, then perhaps it's time for humanity to reconsider what promises we've made to this council. The implication hit the chamber like a physical force. Humanity was threatening to withdraw from the council, something no species had ever done. The economic implications alone would be staggering. Human colonies provided nearly 30% of the rare Earth elements that powered Council technology. Human trade routes connected the galaxy's outer reaches to its core worlds. Human scientists had contributed to breakthrough technologies in medicine, engineering, and theoretical physics. But more than that, humanity's reputation for keeping their word, for honoring agreements, even when those agreements were disadvantageous, was what held together countless minor treaties and trade deals throughout Council space. If humans left, the careful web of relationships that kept the galaxy stable would begin to unravel. Council Speaker Vextai, finally, managed to restore something resembling order to the chamber. Its voice, when it spoke, carried undertones that Sarah's translator rendered as barely controlled fury. Ambassador Chun, you are out of order. These are serious accusations that require proper investigation through appropriate channels. This chamber is not the place for emotional outbursts. Sarah smiled then, and something about that smile made several nearby delegates unconsciously lean away from her. You're absolutely right, Speaker Vextai. This chamber has never been the place for emotion. It's a place for cold calculation, for careful politics, for the kind of bloodless decision-making that can sacrifice 12,000 lives for the sake of proper paperwork. Emotion, things like grief and love and the desperate fury of species that has watched its children die while help was denied. These things don't belong here. She turned slowly, her gaze sweeping across the assembled delegates. But I want every member of this council to understand something about humanity that you may have forgotten in your careful calculations. We are not a species that forgets. We remember every kindness and every cruelty. We remember who stands with us in our darkest hours and who turns away when we need help most. And we remember the faces of our children. Sarah reached into her jacket again and withdrew another object, a small hollow projector. When she activated it, the air above the speaking platform filled with images. Faces of the dead. Children laughing in school photos. Families gathered for holiday celebrations. Scientists working in laboratories. Teachers reading to their students. Ordinary people living ordinary lives before they were abandoned to die alone in the dark. The chamber fell silent again as the images cycled through. 12,000 faces. 12,000 stories cut short by indifference and bureaucratic cruelty. "These are the people you failed," Sarah said quietly, her voice now barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying clearly throughout the vast space. "These are the promises you broke. These are the lives that your regulations deemed less important than proper documentation." She deactivated the projector, and the faces faded away, leaving only empty air where they had been. "The human government has instructed me to withdraw our petition for full council membership. We no longer seek a seat at this table. Instead, we are formally serving notice that in 90 days, humanity will withdraw from all council agreements and treaties. We will honor our existing contracts with individual species and governments, but we will no longer pretend that the Galactic Council represents justice or civilization." The chamber exploded again, but this time the chaos was different. Panic was setting in as delegates began to realize the true scope of what Sarah was announcing. Humanity wasn't just leaving the council. They were potentially destabilizing the entire galactic political structure. "Furthermore," Sarah continued, her voice cutting through the noise, "we will be establishing our own mutual defense and aid agreements with any species that shares our belief that promises should be kept and that life has value regardless of proper documentation. The Terran Alliance will provide emergency assistance to any colony, any ship, any people in need, without regard to species or political affiliation or bureaucratic compliance." She gathered her things, preparing to leave, then paused for one final statement. "One last thing. The Galactic Council seems to have forgotten that humanity spent centuries fighting wars on our home planet. We learned how to kill each other with terrifying efficiency long before we learned how to reach the stars. For 300 years, we've chosen cooperation over conflict, diplomacy over destruction, patience over power. We made that choice because we believed this council represented something better than the darkness we left behind on Earth." Sarah's eyes hardened as she looked directly at the council speaker. "That choice was conditional on the belief that our cooperation would be reciprocated, that our trust would be honored, that our people would be protected. You have broken faith with us, council speaker. You have shown us that in your eyes, human lives are worth less than proper forms and regulations. You have reminded us that sometimes the only justice in the universe is the justice you make for yourself." She turned to leave, then stopped one more time. "I suggest the Council consider carefully whether it wants humanity to remember why we were so good at war before we became so committed to peace. Because once we start down that path again, 12,000 dead colonists will seem like a very small number indeed." With that, Ambassador Sarah Chun walked out of the Galactic Council chambers, leaving behind 3 centuries of careful diplomacy and ushering in what historians would later call the most significant shift in galactic politics since the Council's founding. Behind her, in the chaos of the chamber, voices were already being raised in anger, fear, and calculation. Some demanded humanity be censured for their threats. Others called for immediate negotiations to prevent a human withdrawal. A few wise voices suggested that perhaps the Council should examine its own conscience before it was too late. But it was already too late. The words had been spoken, the promises had been broken, and humanity was remembering exactly why they had been so feared before they chose to be loved. In her private quarters aboard the human diplomatic vessel, Sarah Chun sat in darkness and wept for 12,000 souls who would never see their families again. She wept for the children who had died afraid and alone. She wept for the future that was about to unfold, knowing that her words today had likely set in motion events that would reshape the galaxy in blood and fire. But she did not weep for her decision. Some promises, once broken, could never be mended. Some trust, once betrayed, could never be restored. And some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. Humanity was about to remind the galaxy why they had once been the most feared species on their own world. The only question now was whether the Council would have the wisdom to step back from the precipice, or whether they would continue down the path that led to humanity's righteous wrath. In the depths of space, human warships that hadn't been seen in centuries were quietly beginning to move. The sleeping giant was awakening, and when it fully opened its eyes, the galaxy would never be the same again. Admiral Marcus Steele stood on the bridge of the UES Retribution, watching the hyperspace distortion pattern scroll across his tactical display. After 20 years of retirement, he still felt the familiar weight of command settling onto his shoulders like an old coat. The bridge around him hummed with quiet efficiency as his crew prepared for what might be humanity's first military action in 3 centuries. The irony wasn't lost on him. The ship's name had seemed almost prophetic when it was commissioned 5 years ago as part of humanity's cultural preservation fleet, vessels ostensibly built to maintain the traditions and capabilities that had brought humans to the stars. The Galactic Council had barely paid attention to these ships, dismissing them as nostalgia projects for a species trying to hold onto its violent past. They had been half right. The ships were about remembering the past, but not just any past. They were about remembering the part of humanity that could stand against impossible odds and emerge victorious. The part that could stare into the abyss and make it blink first. Admiral, came the voice of Commander Lisa Park, his tactical officer. We're receiving updates from Intelligence Division. The Council has been monitoring our fleet movements for the past 72 hours. Steele nodded grimly. Of course they had. What the Council didn't realize was that humanity had been monitoring their monitoring for considerably longer than that. Human intelligence services had never stopped operating, even during the long peace. They had simply learned to be so subtle, so invisible, that even their existence had become classified at the highest levels. What do they think they're seeing? Steele asked. Standard patrol patterns, mostly. Some ships moving to defensive positions around our core worlds. They seem to believe we're adopting a defensive posture in preparation for withdrawal from Council space. Steele almost smiled. Almost. It would have been his first genuine smile in days, ever since the reports from Kepler Colony had reached his desk. Instead, he simply nodded and turned back to his display. Let the Council think humanity was retreating to lick its wounds. Let them believe that humans were simply going to withdraw quietly into their own space and nursing their grievances in isolation. It would make what was coming all the more effective. The truth was that humanity had learned a great deal about warfare during their 3 centuries of peace. They had studied every conflict in galactic history, analyzed every victory and defeat, absorbed the tactical innovations of hundreds of species. More importantly, they had learned to think like their enemies. The Galactic Council's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness, standardization. Every Council fleet used similar technology, followed similar protocols, relied on similar assumptions about how civilized species conducted warfare. They fought by rules that had been developed over millennia of conflicts between species that shared common values about honor, proportionality, and acceptable losses. Humanity had never agreed to those rules. Commander Park, Steele said quietly, have we received confirmation from the Shadow Fleet? Yes, sir. All 18 vessels report ready status. They're maintaining position in the void between Council sectors, completely off the shipping lanes and sensor networks. The Shadow Fleet. Even the name was a classified secret known to fewer than 100 humans in the entire galaxy. For 50 years, humanity's best engineers have been designing and building warships that didn't officially exist. Ships that were never recorded in any registry, never appeared on any manifest, never showed up in any budget that the Council might monitor. The technology that made them possible was uniquely human. Other species had developed stealth systems, but they were always compromises, reducing one form of detection while accepting vulnerability to another. Human stealth was different. It was based on a fundamental understanding that the universe was vast and empty, and that sometimes the best place to hide was in plain sight. The Shadow Fleet ships looked like asteroids to most sensors. They generated heat signatures consistent with decaying radioactive, or their electromagnetic emissions matched the background radiation of dead space. They could drift for months in the emptiness between stars, completely invisible to any detection system the Council possessed. And each one carried enough firepower to level a planet. "Sir," another voice called from the communication station. "We're receiving a priority transmission from Earth Command. Admiral Chun is requesting a conference with you and the other fleet commanders." Steele turned toward the main screen as it flickered to life, revealing the face of Admiral Diana Chin, Ambassador Sarah Chin's older sister, and the woman who had been quietly preparing humanity for this moment for the better part of a decade. "Marcus," Diana's voice was calm, but Steele could hear the steel beneath it. "I trust your people are ready. As ready as we can be for something we've never done before," Steele replied. "The crews are good, Diana. They understand what we're facing." "Do they?" Diana's question was sharper than it might have appeared to a casual observer. "Because what we're about to do is going to change everything. Not just for us, but for every species in the galaxy. Once we cross this line, there's no going back to the way things were." Steele considered that for a moment. The weight of what they were contemplating was enormous. Humanity was about to abandon 3 centuries of peaceful cooperation and return to their roots as a warrior species. The galaxy would never trust them the same way again. The careful relationships that human diplomats had built over generations would be shattered. But then he thought about the reports from Kepler Colony. The recordings of children crying for parents who couldn't answer because they were already dead. The final transmission from Dr. Webb, forgiving humanity for failing to save his people. The cold calculation that had led Council ships to sit idle while 12,000 humans suffocated. "The line was already crossed, Diana," Steele said quietly. "The Council crossed it when they decided our people were expendable. We're just deciding how to respond." "Good answer." Diana's expression softened slightly. "Sarah's action in the Council chambers has bought us some time. Most Council species are in shock at the idea of humanity withdrawing completely. They're focused on the economic implications and trying to figure out how to maintain stability without our trade routes and resource production. Which means they're not watching for military action." "Exactly. But that window won't last long. Council intelligence isn't stupid, just arrogant. Once they start analyzing our fleet movements more carefully, they're going to realize that our defensive posturing doesn't quite add up." Steele nodded. Humanity's visible fleet movements had been carefully choreographed to suggest a species preparing for isolation rather than aggression. But a careful analysis would reveal subtle inconsistencies, ships positioned not just to defend human space, but to control key hyperspace junctions. Supply convoys moving not just to human worlds, but to points in empty space that would be perfect staging areas for long-range operations. "How much time do you think we have?" Steele asked. "Days, maybe a week. Which is why we're moving to Phase 2 immediately. Operation Prometheus goes live in 6 hours." Steele felt his pulse quicken. Prometheus, the plan that would announce to the galaxy that humanity was no longer asking for permission to protect their people. "All target packages have been confirmed?" he asked. "Every single one. We've identified Council assets responsible for the Kepler Colony decision, plus the command structures that enabled it, military bases, administrative centers, and the personal vessels of the individuals who directly contributed to our people's deaths. Civilian casualties? Zero tolerance, as always. These are precision strikes against military and government targets only. We're not terrorists, Marcus. We're justice." Steele appreciated the distinction, even if he suspected the Council wouldn't see it that way. Humanity's approach to warfare had always been clinical when possible, overwhelming when necessary, but never indiscriminate. They had learned long ago that killing civilians created martyrs. Killing the people responsible for atrocities created examples. "What about the political side?" Steele asked. The Council is going to demand explanations, threaten retaliation, probably try to rally other species against us. Diana's smile was sharp as a blade. Let them try. Sarah's already leaked the full documentation about the 17 other times Council ships refused to help human colonies while providing aid to others for identical violations. The evidence is spreading through diplomatic channels faster than the Council can contain it. Several species are starting to ask uncomfortable questions about whether the same standards are being applied to their own people, creating doubt in the Council's fairness. Exactly. And doubt leads to hesitation. Hesitation leads to paralysis. By the time they figure out how to respond to our political offensive, our military objectives will be accomplished. The screen split to show additional faces, the commanders of humanity's other fleets spread across known space and preparing for simultaneous action. Steele recognized most of them. Veterans of the last wars Earth had fought before joining the Galactic Council. Men and women who had spent decades studying the art of war while their species pursued the arts of peace. Gentlemen, ladies, Diana addressed the assembled commanders. In 6 hours, we remind the galaxy why humanity was once feared throughout our own star system. We show them that cooperation is a choice we make, not a weakness we suffer from. And we make it clear that there are consequences for breaking faith with a species that has spent 3 centuries keeping its word. She paused, looking at each face in turn. I want to be absolutely clear about our objectives. This is not a war of conquest. This is not a campaign of genocide. This is a surgical demonstration of what happens when someone hurts our people and thinks there will be no response. We strike hard, we strike fast, and we make our point so clearly that it will never need to be made again. Steele found himself nodding along with the other commanders. This was what humanity did well, not the messy, emotional aspects of warfare, but the cold, mathematical precision of it. Other species fought wars of passion or ideology. Humans fought wars of engineering problems to be solved and objectives to be achieved. Admiral, Commander Park's voice interrupted his thoughts. We're receiving sensor data from our advanced scouts. Council patrol ships are maintaining standard routes, standard alertness levels. They're not expecting anything. Of course they weren't. In 300 years, humanity had never launched a surprise attack on anyone. They had been the species that sent formal declarations of intent, that provided warnings before taking action, that followed every rule of civilized warfare to the letter. Today, they would learn what happened when civilization failed to protect the civilized. All fleets, this is Admiral Chun. Diana's voice carried across the communications network to every human warship in space. You have your targets, you understand your mission, and you know what this means for our people's future. In 6 hours, we show the galaxy that there are still species that keep their promises, even when those promises are threats. Steele felt the familiar calm that always settled over him before battle. Around him, his crew was completing their final preparations with a quiet efficiency that marked professional warriors. These men and women had trained for this moment their entire careers, even knowing they might never need to use their skills. But they had always known this day might come. Humanity's diplomats might hope for eternal peace, but humanity's warriors planned for the moment when peace failed. They had studied the species that made up the Galactic Council, learned their weaknesses, identified the pressure points that could bring down governments and shatter alliances. And now is time to apply that knowledge. Commander Park, Steele said quietly, bring us to battle stations. All hands to alert status. Begin final targeting verification on our primary objectives. Yes, sir. Shall I transmit the general order? Steele looked out at the stars through the main view screen, thinking of 12,000 people who had died alone and afraid while help sat just hours away. Thinking of children who would never grow up, parents who would never see their families again, dreams that had been snuffed out by bureaucratic cruelty disguised as proper procedure. Transmit to all ships, he said. Today we remind the galaxy that humans keep their promises. All of them, even the ones we make to our enemies. The bridge around him hummed with anticipation as humanity prepared to return to war for the first time in 3 centuries. But this time, they wouldn't be fighting each other. This time, they would be united in purpose, focused in their fury, and absolutely merciless in their pursuit of justice. In 6 hours, the galaxy would learn that there were still worse things than human aggression. There was human disappointment. The first sign that something was wrong came at 0347 Standard Galactic Time, when the Regellian defense platform Omega-7 simply vanished from all sensor displays. Not destroyed, vanished. One moment, it was a massive orbital installation protecting the sector capital, broadcasting routine status updates, and coordinating traffic through the system's busiest hyperspace junction. The next moment, it simply wasn't there anymore. Commander Zektar of the Council Fleet vessel Harmonious Purpose was the first to report the anomaly. His ship had been conducting a routine patrol sweep of a Rigel system when every sensor on his bridge began registering impossible readings. "Sir," his tactical officer stammered, his 4 eyes staring at displays that showed empty space where a military installation the size of a small moon should have been. "I'm reading 0 mass, 0 energy signature, 0 debris. It's like the platform never existed." Zektar, a veteran of 40 years of Council service, had never encountered anything like this. Defense platforms didn't just disappear. They were among the most heavily defended installations in Council space, protected by energy shields that could withstand direct hits from capital ship weaponry and surrounded by automated defense systems that could engage hundreds of targets simultaneously. "Run a full system diagnostic," he ordered, his translator converting his whistling native language into Standard Galactic. "Check for sensor malfunction, interference patterns, anything that might explain this reading." For 20 minutes, his crew ran every test they could think of. The sensors were functioning perfectly. There was no interference, no unusual background radiation, no evidence of any phenomenon that might mask a structure as large as Omega-7. It had simply ceased to exist. "Sir," the communications officer called out, "I'm receiving priority alert from defense platforms Omega-3, Omega-12, and Omega-19. They're reporting similar incidents. Entire installations vanishing from sensors." Zektar felt his gill slits fluttering rapidly, a sign of extreme stress in his species. 4 defense platforms, spread across different star systems, couldn't all suffer simultaneous technical failures. Something was actively destroying them. "Send an immediate alert to Council Command," he ordered. "Priority 1 emergency. Unknown force engaging Council military assets with unprecedented capability. Request immediate reinforcement," and his words were cut off by an alarm that had never sounded on his bridge before. The proximity warning that indicated massive objects materializing directly alongside his vessel. On the main view screen, ships began to appear. But these weren't like any vessels in Council space. They were dark, angular, almost organic in their flowing lines. They seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, making them difficult to look at directly. And they were enormous, each one easily 3 times the mass of his heavy cruiser. Unknown vessels. "This is Commander Zektar of the Council Fleet ship Harmonious Purpose," he broadcast on all frequencies. "You are in violation of Council space. Identify yourselves immediately and state your intentions." The response came not in words, but in action. One of the strange ships fired a single weapon, a beam of energy unlike anything in Council databases. It struck the Harmonious Purpose's forward shields and passed through them as if they weren't there. The beam struck the ship's hull and began to slice through it with surgical precision, cutting away weapon systems, sensor arrays, and engine mounts without touching any area where the crew might be located. In less than 30 seconds, Zektar's warship had been reduced to a floating metal shell, completely helpless but with every crew member unharmed. Only then did the communication arrive. "Council Vessel Harmonious Purpose. This is Admiral Marcus Steele of the Terran Defense Force. You and Your crew are alive because my orders are to minimize casualties among personnel who are not directly responsible for the atrocity committed against the Kepler colony. Consider yourselves fortunate. The voice was flat, emotionless, delivered with the kind of professional calm that suggested its speaker was accustomed to life and death decisions. But beneath that calm, Zektar could hear something that made his gill slits clamp shut in fear. You will transmit the following message to Council Command, the human voice continued. The Terran Alliance is formally notifying the Galactic Council that we are taking direct action against those individuals and installations responsible for the deliberate abandonment of 12,000 human civilians to preventable death. This action is not an act of war against the Council as a whole, but a specific response to specific crimes. Zektar's communications officer was frantically recording every word while trying to re-establish contact with Council Command. But something was interfering with their long-range communications, probably whatever technology had allowed these human ships to approach completely undetected. The following individuals are hereby designated as war criminals by the Terran Alliance. Admiral Steele's voice continued, and the message began listing names, ranks, and locations. The Sword Hat commander who had refused aid to Kepler Colony. The council administrators who had written the policies that prioritized paperwork over lives. The politicians who had voted to maintain those policies despite knowing their deadly consequences. As the list continued, Zektar realized with growing horror that the humans weren't just angry. They were methodical. They had identified every person in the chain of command that had led to the Kepler Colony massacre, and they were announcing their intention to hold each one accountable. Furthermore, Steele's voice continued, the Terran Alliance is serving notice that any Council asset used to shelter, protect, or transport designated war criminals will be considered a legitimate military target. Any Council vessel that interferes with Terran justice operations will be disabled or destroyed as necessary. The communication ended abruptly, leaving Zektar and his crew floating helplessly in space while the human warships moved away at impossible speed. Within minutes, they had vanished as completely as they had appeared, leaving only the crippled Council cruiser and a message that would reshape galactic politics forever. Across Council space, similar scenes were playing out with terrifying efficiency. Human ships appeared without warning at military installations, government facilities, and diplomatic compounds. They struck with surgical precision, eliminating specific targets while leaving everything else untouched. On the Centauran administrative world of New Geneva, Admiral Thexcall of the Council Strategic Command was in an emergency meeting with his staff when the building's outer wall simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed, dissolved. The humans had used some kind of molecular disruptor that reduced reinforced metal and ceramic to its component atoms, opening the conference room to the outside air like a dollhouse with its front wall removed. Floating in the air, just beyond the missing wall, was a human soldier in powered armor, held aloft by some kind of gravitic system. Through the armor's transparent faceplate, Admiral Thexcall could see a young woman with cold, professional eyes. Admiral Thexcall, the soldier said, her voice amplified by external speakers. By order of the Terran Alliance War Crimes Tribunal, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit genocide through criminal neglect. You will come with me now. This is outrageous, Thexcall sputtered, his species' natural blue coloration deepening to purple with indignation. I have diplomatic immunity. The Council will do nothing, the soldier replied calmly. Because the Council has no idea where you're going. Our intelligence indicates you personally signed the order denying emergency assistance to the Kepler colony despite having full knowledge of the humanitarian crisis. You chose bureaucracy over life. Now you face the consequences. Before Thexcall could respond further, the human soldier activated some kind of transport beam. Both figures vanished, leaving behind only empty air and a room full of shocked Council officials staring at the impossible absence of their commanding officer. Similar arrests were happening across the galaxy as human strike teams materialized in secure facilities, extracted specific individuals, and vanished again before any response could be organized. The technology involved was beyond anything the Council understood. Humans had developed stealth systems, transport technology, and weapons capabilities that made their published military assessments completely obsolete. But the most shocking revelation came when the detained Council officials began arriving at their destination. The humans hadn't taken them to some secret prison or hidden facility. Instead, they found themselves aboard a massive space station orbiting a dead star in an unnamed system. The station was clearly human in design, but its scale was breathtaking. It was larger than most Council worlds, a geometric masterpiece of engineering that could have housed millions of people. And it was populated entirely by robots. Not androids or artificial intelligences, but clearly mechanical constructs that moved with precise efficiency through corridors filled with advanced technology. The prisoners were processed by these machines, assigned quarters, provided with food and medical care appropriate to their species, and given access to legal documentation explaining their situation. They were being charged with crimes against sentience under human law. They would be given fair trials with legal representation. They would be allowed to present evidence in their defense and call witnesses on their behalf. Every aspect of the proceedings would be recorded and transmitted to their home governments. It was in every sense the kind of civilized justice that the Council claimed to represent. Except for one crucial detail. The humans had unilaterally declared jurisdiction over Council citizens and were enforcing that jurisdiction with overwhelming military force. Admiral Thexcall found himself in a holding cell with several other Council officials, all trying to comprehend what was happening to them. The cell was comfortable, more like a small apartment than a prison, but there was no doubt about their status. "This is unprecedented," muttered Council Security Director Vashtan, her tentacled form coiled in obvious distress. "No species has ever claimed the right to arrest Council officials for actions taken in the course of their duties." "I don't think they care about precedent," replied Administrator Melkoth, staring through the transparent wall at the robots moving through the corridors beyond. "Look at this place. This station, this technology. How long have the humans been preparing for something like this?" The answer, though none of them knew it, was 50 years. Ever since humanity had joined the Council and begun to understand how galactic politics really worked. Human planners had realized that their species' commitment to cooperation and compromise made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of systematic discrimination they had just experienced. So they had prepared, in secret, using resources carefully hidden from Council oversight. They had built the infrastructure necessary to enforce their own justice when galactic justice failed them. The robot staff station was just one of many hidden human facilities scattered throughout the galaxy, each one designed for a specific aspect of the contingency plan that was now being implemented. But the robots weren't the most shocking discovery awaiting the Council prisoners. That revelation came when they were brought before the tribunal that would judge their cases. The judges weren't human. The three-member tribunal consisted of an Altarian philosophy professor, a vegan ethics specialist, and a Procyon legal scholar. All three species were known for their commitment to abstract principles of justice and their reputation for impartiality. All three had been recruited by human agents and brought to the secret station to ensure that the trials couldn't be dismissed as human vengeance masquerading as justice. "This tribunal has been convened," announced the Altarian judge, her crystal-like form refracting the chamber's light into prismatic patterns, to determine whether the defendant's actions in connection with the Kepler colony incident constitute crimes against sentience under established galactic legal principles. Admiral Thexcall realized with growing dread that the humans hadn't just kidnapped him. They had constructed an entire parallel legal system, staffed with respected non-human jurists, operating under established legal principles, and backed by military force that made resistance impossible. It was exactly the kind of systematic, long-term planning that humanity had been famous for during their early space exploration period. They didn't just solve immediate problems. They anticipated future challenges and prepared comprehensive solutions years or even decades in advance. The galaxy was about to learn that humanity's 3 centuries of peaceful cooperation hadn't been a sign of weakness or pacifism. It had been a strategic choice made by a species that understood the value of patience and long-term thinking. And now that patience was over. In the depths of the hidden station, human technicians monitored communications from across Council space as news of the arrests and trials spread. Panic was setting in among Council leadership as they realized the scope of humanity's capabilities. Emergency sessions were being called, military alerts were being issued, and desperate diplomatic overtures were being transmitted toward human space. But the humans weren't responding to any of it. They had said everything they needed to say in Admiral Steele's message to the crippled Council cruiser. Blood and honor had crossed paths in the darkness between stars, and the galaxy was about to learn which one would prove stronger. The emergency session of the Galactic Council was unlike anything in the organization's 800-year history. Representatives from over 200 species packed the Great Chamber, but instead of the usual cacophony of diplomatic discourse, an oppressive silence hung over the assembled delegates. For the first time anyone could remember, every single seat was filled. Even species that had never shown interest in council politics had sent representatives to witness what many believed might be the end of galactic civilization as they knew it. Council Speaker Vextai's crystalline form flickered with stress patterns as she called the session to order. In the 3 days since the human action had begun, the Council had lost all communication with 17 military installations, 43 administrative facilities, and over 200 high-ranking officials. The humans had struck with such precision and coordination that many delegates were beginning to suspect their own governments had been infiltrated years ago. The emergency session will come to order, Vextai announced, her translated voice carrying undertones of barely controlled panic. We gather to address the unprecedented crisis facing our civilization. The so-called Terran Alliance has committed acts of war against Council sovereignty, kidnapped Council officials, and threatened the fundamental principles upon which our society is built. A rumble of agreement passed through the chamber, but it was notably subdued. Too many delegates had seen the evidence that Ambassador Sarachon had presented days earlier. The recordings from Kepler Colony, the documentation of systematic discrimination, the faces of 12,000 dead humans. Those images had spread throughout diplomatic channels faster than the Council could contain them. I call upon Defense Coordinator Threxmal to present the military situation report, Vextai continued. The Centauran military leader rose slowly, his usual confident bearing replaced by obvious uncertainty. He was a veteran of dozens of conflicts, but he had never faced anything like humanity's surgical strikes. Honored delegates, Threxmal began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was reporting. In 72 hours, the humans have demonstrated military capabilities that exceed our current understanding of what their technology should allow. Their ships appear and disappear without triggering our sensor networks. Their weapons pass through our defensive systems as if they don't exist. And their intelligence gathering appears to be comprehensive enough to have identified specific individuals across hundreds of worlds simultaneously. He paused, looking around the chamber at faces representing species that had considered themselves among the galaxy's most advanced civilizations. More troubling, he continued, is the precision of their targeting. In every action, they have avoided civilian casualties completely. They disabled our military installations without harming a single non-combatant. They extracted specific individuals from secure facilities without injuring anyone not directly involved in the Kepler Colony decision. This suggests a level of operational control that he struggled to find words, that I have never encountered in 4 decades of military service. Delegate Mordun of the Vegan Assembly raised one of her scaled appendages. Defense Coordinator, what is the current status of our detained personnel? They are alive and unharmed, Threxmal replied. The humans have allowed limited communication with the detainees. They are being held in what appears to be a massive hidden facility of unknown location. They are receiving proper care, legal representation, and he paused again, clearly struggling with the implications. And they're being tried under established galactic legal principles by a tribunal of non-human judges. The chamber erupted in confused voices. This was not what any of them had expected to hear. Non-human judges? Delegate Keflar of the Rigelian hegemony demanded. What do you mean? The tribunal consists of respected legal scholars from the Altarian, Vegan, and Procyon systems. All three are known for their commitment to impartial justice. The humans appear to have recruited them specifically to ensure their trials cannot be dismissed as vengeance disguised as law. The implications hit the chamber like a physical force. The humans weren't acting like conquerors or terrorists. They were conducting themselves like a legitimate government enforcing established law through proper legal channels. They had simply done so without asking permission and with military force that made resistance impossible. This is still illegal, Speaker Vextai declared, her crystalline form now flickering rapidly. Whatever the moral justifications, the humans have no right to enforce their own justice system on council citizens. They have violated every principle of sovereignty and international law. Have they? The question came from an unexpected source. Delegate Yiltar of the Andromedan Collective, one of the Council's founding species and generally considered among its most conservative voices. Because I've been reviewing the legal documentation that the Human Tribunal has transmitted to our governments. Their charges are based on the universal principles of sentient rights that we all signed when we joined the Council. Yiltar's statement sent another wave of shocked murmurs through the chamber. The universal principles were the foundational legal document that governed interactions between Council species. They had been written 800 years ago as a framework for preventing exactly the kind of systematic discrimination that humans were claiming to have suffered. The humans, Yiltar continued, are arguing that the Kepler colony incident constitutes a crime against sentience under Section 12 of the Universal Principles. Any action or policy that results in the preventable death of sentient beings through deliberate indifference or discriminatory application of aid protocols. They're claiming that Council officials violated fundamental galactic law by refusing assistance based on species bias rather than legitimate policy concerns. That's ridiculous, Defense Coordinator Threxmal protested. The Kepler colony was denied aid because of regulatory violations, not species discrimination. Was it? Yiltar's question was quiet, but it carried clearly through the chamber. Because the human evidence suggests that 43 non-human colonies received emergency aid despite similar or worse regulatory violations in the same time period. If that's true, then the discrimination argument has merit under established law. Council Speaker Vextai was beginning to realize that the legal ground was shifting beneath their feet. The humans weren't just using force to impose their will. They were using force to enforce laws that the Council had already agreed to follow. It was a brilliant strategy that turned the Council's own legal framework against itself. Even if their legal arguments have merit, Vextai said desperately, the humans have no authority to enforce galactic law unilaterally. The proper channels exist for the proper channels failed, interrupted a new voice from the chamber's diplomatic section. Every head turned as Ambassador Sarah Chun walked onto the speaking floor, her human diplomatic credentials still technically valid for another 87 days. Ambassador Chun, Vextai said coldly, you are no longer recognized as having speaking privileges in this chamber. Then, I'm not speaking as a diplomat, Sarah replied calmly. I'm speaking as the designated representative of the Terran Alliance War Crimes Tribunal. I'm here to deliver a formal communication regarding the legal proceedings currently underway. The chamber fell silent as Sarah activated a portable holographic projector. The air above the speaking platform filled with the image of a formal legal document, written in the standard galactic legal format, but bearing seals and signatures that none of them recognized. The Terran Alliance hereby formally notifies the Galactic Council that is exercising its rights under Section 47 of the Universal Principles of Sentient Rights, Sarah read aloud. When established legal authorities fail to enforce fundamental protections, affected parties retain the inherent right to seek justice through alternative means, provided those means conform to established legal standards and principles. Section 47. It was an obscure clause that had been included in the Universal Principles primarily for theoretical completeness. The drafters had never imagined a situation where it might actually be invoked. It was the galactic equivalent of a revolution clause, the legal recognition that sometimes established governments failed so completely that citizens had the right to seek justice outside official channels. Furthermore, Sarah continued, the Terran Alliance invites any council member who believes their own citizens have been subjected to discriminatory treatment to submit evidence to the tribunal for review. We are prepared to seek justice for any species that has suffered what humanity has suffered. The offer hung in the air like an explosive charge. Sarah was essentially inviting other species to bypass the council and seek justice through human-administered courts. If even a few species accepted, the council's authority would be permanently undermined. This is blackmail, Speaker Vextai declared. No, Sarah replied quietly. This is accountability. For 800 years, the Council has promised justice for all member species. For 800 years, you've claimed to represent civilization and fairness and the rule of law. We gave you 3 centuries to keep those promises where humanity was concerned. You failed. Systematically and repeatedly, you failed. She gestured to the holographic document floating above them. This is what happens when institutions become so corrupt that citizens have to create new institutions to protect themselves. This is what happens when governments become so focused on procedure that they forget the people those procedures are supposed to serve. This is what happens when promises are broken one too many times by people who thought there would never be consequences. Sarah turned slowly, her gaze taking in the assembled delegates. The Terran Alliance is not seeking to destroy the Council or conquer the galaxy. We're seeking to establish a parallel system of justice for when this system fails. Other species are welcome to participate, or they can continue to trust their fates to an organization that has just spent 3 days proving it cares more about maintaining its own authority than about protecting innocent lives. The chamber remained silent as Sarah deactivated her projector and prepared to leave. Ambassador Chun, Speaker Vextai called out, what will it take for the humans to return to normal diplomatic relations? Sarah paused at the edge of the speaking platform. Justice, she said simply. Real justice, not the pretense of justice. When the people responsible for 12,000 deaths have been held accountable, when the policies that enabled those deaths have been changed, when the Council proves it values lives more than paperwork, then we can talk about normal relations. She started to leave again, then stopped one more time. But understand this. Humanity will never again trust the Council to protect our people. We will maintain our parallel justice system indefinitely. We will continue to hold Council officials accountable when Council law fails to do so. And we will provide assistance to any species that asks for our help in seeking justice when your system fails them. With that, Ambassador Sarah Chun walked out of the Galactic Council chambers for the second and final time, leaving behind a room full of delegates who were beginning to understand that the galaxy had fundamentally changed in the space of a few days. In the silence that followed her departure, several delegates began to quietly consult with their aides about the evidence packages that human intelligence had been distributing through diplomatic channels. Evidence of other incidents, other cases where Council justice had failed, other species that might have legitimate grievances against the system. The humans had opened a door that could never be closed again. They had shown that the Council's authority was not absolute, that its justice was not inevitable, and that alternatives were possible for those willing to build them. In hidden bases throughout the galaxy, human engineers were already beginning construction on additional tribunal stations. They had proven the concept worked. Now, they were preparing to scale it up. The age of unquestioned Council authority was ending. The age of competing justice systems had begun, and in the darkness between stars, blood and honor had crossed paths to create something entirely new. The possibility that in a galaxy full of advanced civilizations, justice might finally have a chance to catch up with technology. 6 months after the first human strikes against Council assets, Ambassador Sarah Chun stood in the observation deck of Justice Station Alpha, watching ships arrive from across the galaxy. The massive structure had grown considerably since its initial construction, with new sections being added weekly to accommodate the increasing number of species seeking alternatives to Council justice. Through the transparent aluminum viewport, she could see vessels from dozens of different civilizations docking at the station's expanded ports. Regalian transport ships carrying evidence of mining contract violations. Centauran diplomatic vessels loaded with documentation of trade discrimination. Even a few council member species were quietly sending representatives to explore what the humans were calling the alternative justice framework. It's remarkable, isn't it? The voice belonged to Dr. Elena Vasquez, the human legal scholar who had designed much of the station's judicial infrastructure. 6 months ago, we were just trying to get justice for Kepler Colony. Now we're processing cases from 47 different species. Sarah nodded, though her expression remained thoughtful. The success of the alternative justice framework was undeniable, but it came with complications she hadn't fully anticipated when she walked out of the council chambers. "Any word from the Altarian Tribunal on the Kepler cases?" she asked. "Verdicts came in yesterday," Elena replied, consulting her tablet. "Guilty on all charges. Admiral Thexcall and the other primary defendants have been sentenced to reparations and community service. They'll be working on humanitarian aid projects for the next decade under tribunal supervision. The Sword Hat commander who directly refused assistance has been stripped of rank and barred from military service permanently." Sarah felt a complex mix of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but it couldn't bring back the 12,000 people who had died in the void. Nothing could repair that fundamental break in trust between humanity and the galactic community. "What about the systemic reforms?" she asked. "That's where things get interesting," Elena said, her voice taking on the tone of someone about to deliver significant news. "The Council passed the Universal Emergency Response Protocol yesterday. Unanimous vote. Any colony in distress can now receive immediate aid regardless of regulatory status, with paperwork handled after lives are saved rather than before." Sarah turned from a viewport to look at Elena directly. "They actually did it? They changed the policies?" "More than that. They've invited human representatives to participate in drafting new anti-discrimination protocols. Apparently, several council species have discovered that their own people have been subjected to the same kind of systematic bias that humans experienced. The evidence packages our intelligence services distributed have opened up quite a few uncomfortable conversations." Sarah walked to one of the observation deck's seating areas, Elena following her. The weight of what they had accomplished and the responsibility for what came next was sometimes overwhelming. "So we won," Sarah said, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. "In a narrow sense, yes. The people responsible for Kepler Colony have been held accountable. The policies that enabled their crimes have been changed, and the Council has acknowledged that its previous approach was flawed. But Elena smiled grimly. But we've also fundamentally altered the balance of power in the galaxy. The alternative justice framework now processes more cases per month than the official council courts. 17 species have formally requested to join our system as full participants, and 3 council member species have threatened to withdraw from the council entirely if more reforms aren't implemented." Sarah leaned back in her chair, considering the implications. When she had walked into the council chambers 6 months ago, her goal had been simple: force the galaxy to acknowledge that human lives had value. She hadn't intended to spark a galactic constitutional crisis. "There's something else," Elena continued. "Admiral Steele wants to speak with you. He's been monitoring council military communications, and there are some developments you should know about." As if summoned by her words, Admiral Marcus Steele entered the observation deck, his expression grim but determined. Over the past 6 months, he had become the unofficial commander of humanity's expanded military presence, overseeing not just the ships that enforce tribunal decisions, but also the growing fleet of vessels from other species that had requested human protection while their own cases were processed. "Sarah," he said, settling into a chair across from her, "we need to talk about the hegemony." Sarah's stomach tightened. The Regalian hegemony was one of the Council's oldest and most powerful members, with military capabilities that rivaled humanity's even after their recent technological revelations. If the hegemony was making moves against the alternative justice framework. "What kind of moves?" Sarah asked. "They're mobilizing their fleet," Steele replied bluntly. 60 ships, including their newest dreadnoughts. Officially, they're conducting training exercises. Unofficially, our intelligence suggests they're preparing to take direct action against our justice stations. On whose authority? That's where it gets complicated. We don't think they have official council approval. This appears to be a unilateral decision by hegemony leadership, probably motivated by the fact that we're currently processing discrimination cases filed by 3 of their client species. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of leadership settling onto her shoulders. She had hoped that the council's policy reforms would be enough to prevent further escalation. Apparently, some factions were more interested in preserving their authority than in accepting accountability. "Military options?" she asked. "We can defend ourselves," Steele said confidently. "Our technological advantages haven't diminished, and we've had 6 months to refine our capabilities. If the hegemony wants a direct confrontation, they'll lose. But the cost?" He shook his head. "We're talking about potential casualties in the hundreds of thousands, maybe millions if the conflict spreads." Sarah stood and walked back to the viewport, watching the steady stream of ships bringing cases to Justice Station Alpha, representatives of species that had never before had access to impartial justice. Families seeking accountability for loved ones who had been failed by distant bureaucracies. Scientists and philosophers working to create better legal frameworks for an increasingly complex galaxy. All of it would be destroyed if the situation devolved into open warfare. "There's another option," she said quietly. "One that might avoid the bloodshed entirely." "What do you have in mind?" Steele asked. Sarah turned back to face him, and Elena, her expression resolute. "We make them an offer they can't refuse. Not because we're threatening them, but because what we're offering is genuinely better than what they have now." She activated the chamber's holographic display, bringing up a 3-dimensional map of council space. Hundreds of worlds, thousands of trade routes, countless species all trying to coexist under a single governmental framework that was clearly failing to serve many of them. "The alternative justice framework has been successful beyond our wildest expectations," Sarah said. "We've processed more cases in 6 months than the council handles in 2 years. We've resolved disputes that have been festering for decades. We've provided meaningful justice to species that had given up hope of ever receiving it." She gestured to the map, highlighting areas where the framework's influence was strongest. "But we've been thinking too small. The framework isn't just an alternative to council justice. It's a prototype for an entirely different way of organizing galactic civilization. What if we offered to expand it? Not as a replacement for the council, but as a parallel system that species could choose to join voluntarily." Elena leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest. "A voluntary confederation based on shared commitment to justice rather than political expedience." "Exactly. Species that join commit to accepting framework jurisdiction for certain classes of disputes, war crimes, discrimination, systematic abuse of power. In exchange, they get access to our technological resources, our defense networks, and our trade systems." Steele frowned thoughtfully. "It's ambitious. Maybe too ambitious. You're talking about creating a counter-council that could eventually become more powerful than the original." "I'm talking about giving every species in the galaxy a choice," Sarah replied. "They can continue to accept council authority with all its flaws and compromises, or they can join a system based on the principle that justice shouldn't depend on political convenience. She turned back to the map, zooming in on regions where the framework had been most active. The hegemony is mobilizing because they're afraid of what we represent. They're afraid that if too many species choose our system over theirs, they'll lose the power that comes from being one of the Council's permanent members. They're right to be afraid. But that fear is exactly what makes this dangerous, Steele pointed out. If they believe we're trying to destroy their way of life, they'll fight to preserve it. Then, we make it clear that we're not trying to destroy anything, Sarah said. We're trying to create something better. Something that includes everyone who wants to be included, including the hegemony itself. She manipulated the display to show projected growth patterns for the framework over the next decade, based on current adoption rates. We formally invite the Rigelian hegemony to join the Alternative Justice Framework as a founding partner. We offer them full participation in framework governance, access to all our technological innovations, and a guarantee that their legitimate interests will be protected under framework law. Elena's eyes widened. You want to invite our potential enemies to become our partners? I want to eliminate the distinction between enemies and partners, Sarah replied. The framework's strength isn't military power, it's moral authority. If we can demonstrate that our system works better than theirs, that it provides genuine justice and meaningful protection for all participants, then we don't need to fight anyone. They'll choose to join us because joining serves their interests better than opposing us does. Steele was silent for a long moment, clearly running tactical scenarios through his mind. Finally, he nodded slowly. It's risky. If they accept the invitation, we'll be giving them inside access to all our systems and capabilities. If they're planning to sabotage us from within, then we'll discover it quickly and respond accordingly, Sarah said. But I don't think they are. I think they're mobilizing because they're scared and they don't see any alternative except fighting. If we give them a better alternative. She let the implication hang in the air. There's precedent for this approach, Elena said suddenly. Human history is full of examples where bitter enemies became close allies once they found common ground. Sometimes the best way to defeat an opponent is to make them your partner. Sarah smiled for the first time in days. Exactly. And the Rigelian hegemony isn't our enemy. They're just another species trying to protect their people and preserve their way of life. We can work with that. She manipulated the holographic display one more time, showing not just current framework membership, but projected expansion over the next century. The image that emerged showed a galaxy where justice wasn't the monopoly of any single organization, but rather a shared commitment among countless species working together. 6 months ago, blood and honor crossed paths when the Council failed to protect our people, Sarah said quietly. That collision changed everything. It forced us to choose between acceptance and action, between quiet suffering and loud justice. We chose action, and the galaxy is better for it. She gestured to the viewport, where ships from across the galaxy continue to arrive, seeking framework justice. Now we have another choice to make. We can view the hegemony's fleet buildup as a threat to be countered with force, or we can view it as an opportunity to prove that our system truly is better, that it can turn potential enemies into committed partners, that it can create a galaxy where blood and honor don't have to cross paths in violence, but can instead walk together towards something better. Admiral Steele stood and moved to the viewport, watching a massive Centauran transport ship dock with the station. After a moment, he nodded. "Send the invitation," he said. "Formal diplomatic channels, full honors, maximum transparency. If the hegemony wants to test our system, let them do it as participants rather than opponents." Sarah felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. The path ahead would still be difficult, but for the first time since the Kepler Colony massacre, she believed they were moving towards something genuinely hopeful rather than just away from something terrible. "Elena," she said, "draft the invitation. Make it clear that we're not asking them to abandon the Council or renounce their existing commitments. We're simply offering them a choice, the same choice we're offering every species in the galaxy. And if they refuse? Elena asked. Sarah looked out at the stars, thinking of 12,000 people who had died alone and afraid, but also of the thousands more who had found justice through the framework. Thinking of species that had spent centuries suffering in silence until humanity showed them an alternative. Thinking of the future that was taking shape in the darkness between stars. If they refuse, she said quietly, then we'll defend ourselves with the same determination that we've shown in pursuing justice. But I don't think they will refuse. I think they'll realize what we've realized, that the galaxy is big enough for multiple systems of justice and strong enough to benefit from the competition between them. In the months that followed, the Rigelian hegemony would indeed accept the invitation, becoming one of the alternative justice framework's most committed partners. Other council species would follow, creating a complex but stable multipolar galaxy where different systems competed to provide better justice rather than simply defending their existing authority. The collision between blood and honor that began with the Kepler colony massacre had ultimately created something unprecedented in galactic history, a civilization based not on the dominance of the strong, but on the principle that justice was worth fighting for and worth building together. Humanity had kept its promise to the dead of Kepler colony. Justice had been served, systems had been changed, and the galaxy had been reminded that some lines should never be crossed. But more importantly, they had created something new, proof that even in the vast darkness between stars, it was possible to build light.